Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. Lindsay Marshall had always been the picture of success. At just 23 years old, she had already made a name for herself in the fashion industry as a model who could turn heads with the mere flick of her hair. In the span of just a few years, she graced the covers of major magazines, walked the runways of prestigious fashion shows, and worked with some of the biggest brands in the world. From luxury brands like Gucci to emerging designers showcasing their collections during Fashion Week, Lindsay was at the top of her game. But despite the glitzy appearances and endless praise from photographers, designers, and fans, Lindsay's life wasn't as perfect as it appeared. Behind the carefully curated images of a flawless model, Lindsay was facing a growing sense of unease. There were the late-night photo shoots that drained her, the constant pressure to stay in shape, and the stress of keeping up appearances. The demands of her career left little time for her personal life, and with every new success came a deepening loneliness. Lindsay knew she needed a break, some time to recharge and reconnect with the things that mattered outside of the shallow, fast-paced world she inhabited. But the more successful she became, the more people began to demand her attention, pulling her deeper into a life she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to live. It was at this point in her career that Lindsay first noticed him. Luca. He was a seemingly harmless fan, the type of person Lindsay occasionally saw in the comments section of her social media posts. At first, he had been like any other admirer, leaving supportive messages about how much he loved her work and her sense of style. She had seen his name pop up often enough to recognize it. Luca seemed like a dedicated follower, commenting on every photo she posted, liking her Instagram stories, and even retweeting her latest interviews or fashion show appearances. It felt flattering at first, the kind of attention that any young woman in the public eye would welcome, especially a model who thrived on admiration and validation. But as time went on, the comments began to change. They grew more personal, more specific. At first, it was a compliment about her outfit, but then Luca started making remarks about the way she held herself, about the way her eyes seemed to sparkle in the latest photo shoot. Lindsay couldn't help but feel a slight tinge of discomfort when she read these comments. He knew too much. He talked about her like he knew her, as though he was able to read her thoughts just by looking at a single photograph. There was something unsettling about his remarks, but Lindsay dismissed them as overthinking, perhaps imagining things where there was nothing. As the weeks passed, Luca's attention became more intense. What had once been a few harmless comments on her social media posts evolved into daily messages. He sent her direct messages on Instagram, commenting on everything from her latest work to her personal life. The messages weren't aggressive, but there was a growing possessiveness in the way he wrote. He praised her beauty and talent, but his words became more intimate, more focused on her physical appearance rather than her accomplishments. "You're more than just a model, Lindsay. You're perfect in every way. I can't stop thinking about you." Lindsay's first reaction was a sense of discomfort mixed with confusion. She didn't want to ignore someone who had supported her career for so long, but at the same time, these messages were beginning to feel like a violation of her privacy. A few weeks later, she received a message that made her blood run cold. "I'm always watching you, Lindsay. I'll be there when you need me." It was innocent enough, right? Just another creepy message from an overzealous fan. But there was something about it, something in the way he phrased it, that made Lindsay uneasy. She didn't know if it was a joke or if he was serious, but something told her that Luca wasn't like the other fans who supported her online. There was a darkness behind his words, an intensity that she couldn't ignore. After receiving the message, Lindsay hesitated for a while before blocking Luca on social media. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it, and she certainly didn't want to seem paranoid. After all, she had so many fans, it was impossible to keep track of every one of them. But even as she blocked Luca's accounts, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't heard the last from him. Days passed, and Lindsay went back to her usual routine of photo shoots, brand events, and media appearances. But it wasn't long before she started noticing strange things. She had been out with some friends for a casual dinner when she spotted a man across the room, sitting alone at a table with a drink in his hand. The man had his eyes fixed on her, and though he wasn't being overt about it, Lindsay felt an eerie sense of recognition. It was Luca. She quickly brushed it off as a coincidence. After all, New York City was a huge place, and Lindsay wasn't exactly an anonymous figure. Still, the unsettling feeling lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that Luca was somehow always close by, watching her, even when she couldn't see him. Over the next few weeks, she began to notice him more and more. It wasn't just at dinner parties or social gatherings anymore. He started appearing at her photo shoots. One day, while she was walking into a high-profile event at a fashion boutique, she saw him standing on the edge of the crowd. She stopped dead in her tracks. He was standing there watching her with those piercing eyes, and for the first time Lindsay truly felt terrified. The feeling wasn't new, but the way it was settling in the pit of her stomach was. He was always around, always watching. At the next shoot, the worst happened. Lindsay was modeling a new collection for a prominent designer. The set was buzzing with activity, with photographers snapping shots and lighting technicians adjusting the lights. It was just another job, another chance to add to her portfolio. But as she stepped into the spotlight, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the crowd of onlookers. And then she saw him. Luca. Luca wasn't just a fan anymore. He was on set, standing in the corner like he belonged there. He wasn't dressed in the usual fashion for a photographer or a crew member. He was wearing an unremarkable outfit, jeans and a hoodie, but he stood out because he was too still, too focused on her. It was as if he was waiting for her to see him, to acknowledge his presence. Lindsay felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Her heart raced as panic began to flood her senses. She tried to stay calm, but she couldn't take her eyes off of him. Was he really stalking her? Had this gone from admiration to something more sinister? Before she could take action, Luca vanished into the crowd. He wasn't anywhere to be found. She shook it off, telling herself it was probably just a coincidence. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Luca was following her. What started as harmless attention from an adoring fan had now spiraled into something far more dangerous. She was no longer just a model to Luca. She was his obsession. And this was only the beginning of Lindsay's nightmare. Lindsay had always prided herself on being the kind of person who could stay grounded, no matter how high her career took her. Sure, the glamour of the fashion world was intoxicating. Who wouldn't be swept up in the lights, the cameras, the designer outfits, and the VIP events? But Lindsay knew that beneath all the glitter and excitement, there was still a real world. A world where she was just another young woman trying to make it big, trying to succeed, and maybe even trying to find herself along the way. But as much as she tried to remain grounded, Lindsay couldn't deny how much her rise in the industry had changed her. She had gone from an unknown model to someone whose name was whispered in the same breath as the world's top supermodels. She had graced the covers of major fashion magazines, walked the runways for the most prestigious brands, and even landed coveted campaigns for high-end beauty products. In a world where most people would be thrilled by such recognition, Lindsay had begun to feel the strain of it all. She was constantly on the move, jumping from one shoot to another, attending events, and dealing with the pressure of keeping her body in perfect shape. The spotlight had its price, and Lindsay was beginning to realize just how much she had to sacrifice for her success. Relationships had become more difficult to maintain, friends were slowly drifting away, and the demands of her career meant she rarely had time for herself. Despite all of this, she told herself it was worth it. After all, she had always dreamed of being a model. Her parents had never quite understood her ambition, but Lindsay had always known that her path was different from theirs. She wanted to live a life filled with adventure, excitement, and recognition, and she had worked tirelessly to build a career that would allow her to do just that. But the one thing she hadn't counted on, the thing she couldn't have predicted, was Luca. At first, he was just like any other fan. Lindsay had a large following on social media, with thousands of fans who adored her work, commented on her posts, and sent her kind messages. Most of these fans, like Luca, were harmless. They were just people who admired her from afar, a group she had grown accustomed to over time. She never thought much of it when Luca's username started popping up frequently in her comment section. His messages were always full of praise for her beauty and her professionalism. It wasn't unusual for a fan to compliment Lindsay on her appearance. She had heard it 1,000 times, especially in the fashion industry. But there was something about Luca's comments that made her pause. They were different from the usual remarks she received. His comments weren't just about how stunning she looked in her latest photo shoot or how glamorous her outfits were. They were about her as a person. "You're a work of art, Lindsay. I can see your soul through your eyes. There's something special about you that no one else has." At first, Lindsay dismissed these comments as just another overzealous admirer. She couldn't afford to take every message seriously. Still, something about the intensity of Luca's words made her uneasy. She wasn't used to receiving such personal remarks from fans. It was one thing to praise someone's looks, but it was something entirely different to delve into their character, their soul, as he had done. Lindsay had always tried to respond to her fans when she had the time. She felt it was important to maintain a connection with the people who supported her, especially those who had helped her climb the ranks of the modeling world. So, when Luca's comments continued, Lindsay replied with a polite, "Thank you. I'm glad you enjoy my work." It was a standard response, the kind she gave to many fans. But Luca's persistence didn't stop. If anything, it only grew more intense. Soon, his comments weren't just on her social media posts. They were in her DMs, flooding her inbox with longer messages. He spoke about the clothes she wore, the places she traveled, the people she worked with, as though he had studied every single detail of her life. His attention was overwhelming, but Lindsay had no idea that this was only the beginning of what would become a disturbing obsession. In the early stages, she didn't think much of it. He was just another fan. He had a small following on social media and didn't seem to be anyone of particular importance. But the more she noticed his messages, the more the thought of him started to gnaw at the back of her mind. There was something about him that didn't sit right with her. He was too eager, too insistent. And when he started sending her private messages at all hours of the night, Lindsay began to feel the weight of his presence. "I dream about you every night, Lindsay. I can feel your energy through the screen. You're always with me." The messages became more intimate, crossing a line between fan admiration and something far more dangerous. Lindsay tried to ignore it at first. She didn't want to make a big deal out of a few creepy messages, and after all, she had more pressing matters to deal with. There were photo shoots to prepare for, contracts to sign, and interviews to conduct. But no matter how hard she tried to brush it off, Luca's presence loomed large in her mind. One evening, after finishing a photo shoot for a new campaign, Lindsay sat down to check her social media before bed. She was exhausted, her body aching from hours of posing under the hot studio lights, but something told her she needed to check her messages. As she scrolled through her feed, her finger paused on a message from Luca. It was the same kind of message she had gotten before, but this time, it was different. This one made her feel cold all over. "I know where you are, Lindsay. I can see you. I'll always find you no matter where you go." She froze, staring at the screen. This wasn't just a creepy comment anymore. This felt like a threat. It was as if he was aware of her every move, as if he had been watching her. Lindsay's heart started pounding in her chest, her body instinctively tensing up. She looked around her apartment, her eyes darting to the windows, checking to make sure they were locked. But there was nothing. She was alone. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next few days passed in a blur. Lindsay's thoughts were consumed by Luca's message, by the sense that someone she didn't even know, was watching her. Every time she walked out in public, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, checking for any sign of him. She knew it was probably just her imagination, but she couldn't help feeling like she was being followed. It was the worst kind of feeling, being watched without even knowing where the danger was coming from. And then it happened. One afternoon, Lindsay was walking to her car after a photo shoot, trying to focus on the upcoming interview she had later that day. As she approached the car, she heard a voice behind her. She turned around sharply, her heart racing. But there was no one there. At least, no one she could see. And then she heard it, the soft sound of footsteps just behind her. Too close, too deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around again, her eyes scanning the street, the cars, the people walking by. And then she saw him. Luca. There he was, standing on the other side of the street, looking directly at her. His eyes locked with hers, and for a split second, everything in the world stopped. His gaze was intense, unblinking, as if he was daring her to run, to turn away, to act out of fear. But she couldn't move. She couldn't look away. It wasn't until a few moments later, when he turned and disappeared into the crowd, that Lindsay found her voice. She screamed, but no one seemed to hear her. She was alone in the middle of a bustling city, and she felt more isolated than ever. That was when she knew. Luca wasn't just a fan anymore. He was a stalker, and her nightmare was only just beginning. The days following the incident at the photo shoot felt like a blur. Lindsay couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had taken root in her chest. Every morning, she would wake up with the memory of Luca's eyes staring at her, the way he had watched her from across the street, as though he knew something she didn't. The encounter had left her shaken, but she told herself it was just a coincidence. It had to be. A chance encounter, nothing more. After all, she was a public figure, and there were thousands of people in the city who knew who she was. What were the odds that a single fan, someone she didn't even recognize, would follow her? But as the days passed, the feeling of dread only grew stronger. Every time she left her apartment, Lindsay felt the weight of someone's gaze on her. It was as if she could feel the presence of Luca lurking somewhere, just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. Her mornings began to blur into routine. She would wake up early, check her phone for any work-related messages, and prepare for another round of photo shoots. The world of fashion had a way of swallowing up time, and Lindsay had learned to adjust to the hectic pace. But no matter how much she immersed herself in her career, Luca's presence continued to haunt her. It started small, little things she couldn't quite explain. A new follower on her social media accounts with a name she didn't recognize. A comment on her latest Instagram post that was a little too intimate, a little too familiar. She tried to ignore it, brushing it off as just another fan. But then there were the phone calls. It started innocently enough, calls from blocked numbers which Lindsay, at first, thought were just telemarketers or wrong numbers. She never picked them up, but the missed calls began to accumulate. The voicemails left behind were unsettling, long, rambling messages that had no context. Sometimes the voice would be quiet, almost whispering, as though the person on the other end of the line didn't want to be heard. Other times, the voice would crack with emotion, pleading with her to listen, to hear what they had to say. "Lindsay, I know you're out there. You're not alone. I see you. I know everything about you." The words were jarring, and Lindsay couldn't escape the chill that ran down her spine every time she heard them. It wasn't until she received the first text message that she realized how serious the situation had become. It wasn't from a random number. The text was personal, too personal. It mentioned details from her recent photo shoots, referencing the exact outfit she had worn, the color of her lipstick, the location of the shoot. It was as if the person who sent it had been right there with her, watching her every move. She could feel the panic starting to rise in her chest. She wasn't just being stalked online anymore. This person was tracking her, watching her every move. And then, there was the strange sense of familiarity she had when reading the messages, as if she recognized the handwriting, the tone of the words. Lindsay couldn't ignore it any longer. Her worst fears were starting to materialize right before her eyes, and she had no idea how to stop them. Her agent, Becca, had always been her rock. They had been working together for years, and Becca was the one person who truly understood the pressures of Lindsay's career. When Lindsay finally told her about the calls and the messages, Becca listened intently, her face growing more concerned with each passing second. "You need to report this, Lindsay," Becca said firmly, after a long silence. "This isn't something you can just brush off. You have to get the police involved." But Lindsay hesitated. It wasn't that she didn't believe Becca, she did. But what if it was all just a misunderstanding? What if this person was just another overzealous fan who meant no harm? She didn't want to make a big deal out of it, and she certainly didn't want to be the center of some kind of media circus. The last thing Lindsay wanted was to be painted as a victim when she was trying to build a career. But deep down, she knew Becca was right. "I don't want to make this public, Becca," Lindsay said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want people to think I'm weak." "You're not weak," Becca replied firmly. "This is about your safety. You can't let this go on any longer." That night, after their conversation, Lindsay couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her chest. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains in the wind, made her jump. The silence in her apartment was deafening. It was as if she could hear every breath she took, every beat of her heart, and it made her feel more and more isolated. She stared at her phone, wondering if Luca had sent her another message. When the screen finally lit up, she hesitated before opening the text. It was from him. "I'm close, Lindsay. I'm always close. You'll see me soon. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. I'll always be here, waiting for you." Lindsay's fingers trembled as she dropped the phone onto the bed. She felt her stomach twist with fear. The words seemed to hang in the air, and she could feel the presence of Luca surrounding her, almost suffocating her. She could no longer deny it. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a fan. This was something far more sinister. The next day, Lindsay reached out to the police. She knew she had to take action, even though it scared her. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that she couldn't let this go on any longer. She needed help. But even as she reported the stalking to the authorities, a part of her feared that it might already be too late. How long had Luca been watching her? Had he been planning this all along? And why her? She had no answers, only questions, and a growing sense of dread that something terrible was about to happen. The days that followed Lindsay's decision to involve the police felt like a slow descent into a nightmare. Each morning brought a fresh wave of dread, each knock on the door or sound from the hallway making her heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling that Luca was getting closer, lurking just around the corner, waiting for the right moment to strike. The police had taken her case seriously, but Lindsay still couldn't shake the nagging feeling of vulnerability. Despite her efforts to protect herself, Luca seemed to be everywhere. It was as if he was always a step ahead of her, knowing her every move, her every schedule. The paranoia began to seep into every aspect of her life. Every glance in the mirror felt like someone was watching her from behind. Every shadow in the corner of her eye was a potential threat. Lindsay couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't concentrate on the one thing that had once brought her joy, modeling. Her agent, Becca, had been trying to get Lindsay back into her work routine, pushing her to focus on the upcoming photo shoot for a well-known fashion magazine. "You've got this, Lindsay," Becca would reassure her. But Lindsay wasn't sure she had it in her anymore. How could she focus on her work when her mind was constantly racing, wondering if Luca was out there, watching her? The photo shoot was scheduled for the following weekend. It was supposed to be a major stepping stone in Lindsay's career, a high-profile gig with top designers, but it didn't feel like a dream. Instead, it felt like a trap. Lindsay was being pushed back into the world she loved, but this time, it felt unsafe. As the days passed, she found herself dreading the photo shoot more than looking forward to it. She wasn't sure if she could make it through without breaking down. She had even considered canceling, but Becca had insisted it was too important, that Lindsay couldn't afford to let fear control her life. So Lindsay reluctantly agreed to go. On the day of the shoot, she dressed in her outfit for the first set, a sleek black dress with a high collar, designed to evoke a sense of sophistication and mystery. Her makeup was flawless, her hair perfectly styled, but beneath the surface, Lindsay was a mess. Every corner of the studio made her feel like someone was watching. Every movement made her wonder if Luca was there, hidden among the crowd. The photo shoot itself was a blur. She moved from set to set, modeling clothes for various designers, but her mind was elsewhere. She found herself scanning the crowd, her eyes darting to every person who seemed to linger a little too long. A lingering gaze, a strange expression, it all felt wrong. When the photographer called for a break, Lindsay stepped off to the side of the set, her stomach in knots. She needed a moment to herself, away from the chaos. She tried to calm herself, breathing in and out, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She thought about the text message from Luca that had haunted her the night before, and the way his words echoed in her mind. "I'm close, Lindsay. I'm always close. You'll see me soon. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. I'll always be here, waiting for you." It was as if his voice was still in her head, a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded her. She needed to shake the feeling, to get her head back in the game. But then the worst thing happened. Out of the corner of her eye, Lindsay saw a figure slip through the crowd, a tall man with dark hair and a sharp jawline. He wasn't someone she recognized, but there was something about him, something unsettling. He was standing in the corner of the room, watching her with an intensity that sent a chill through her spine. His gaze seemed to pierce through her, as if he knew every secret she had ever kept. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Lindsay froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't breathe. It was him, Luca. It wasn't just the way he looked at her, it was the way he had maneuvered through the studio, unnoticed by anyone else, as if he belonged there, as if he had planned to be there all along. She stood motionless, unable to look away from him, her body frozen in fear. The photographer called for her to come back to the set, but Lindsay couldn't move. She had to get out of there. She needed to escape before Luca made his move. Without thinking, she turned and rushed toward the back exit of the studio, her heels clicking against the floor as she ran. She didn't stop to look behind her. She didn't care who was watching. All she knew was that she had to get away. She had to escape him. As she reached the door, a hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. Lindsay screamed, her heart pounding, her mind spinning. She turned to see Becca standing behind her, her face filled with concern. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Becca asked, her voice laced with confusion. Lindsay didn't know how to answer. She couldn't speak. All she could do was shake her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Lindsay, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Lindsay tried to steady herself, but her legs felt like jelly, her body trembling with fear. She had to tell Becca. She had to explain what was happening, what was going on in her mind. But how could she? How could she tell her agent that a stalker had infiltrated her life, that someone was following her every move? I think he's here," Lindsay whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who?" Becca asked, confused. Lindsay's eyes darted back to the crowd in the studio. Luca was gone. She wasn't sure if he had ever been there at all. Had she imagined it? Had the fear in her mind manifested the way it sometimes did in the dark, when everything seemed distorted and unreal? But the lingering sense of dread didn't go away. It stayed with her, like a shadow that refused to leave. It was clear to Lindsay now. Luca was getting closer, and the danger was more real than she had ever imagined. And for the first time, she realized the true scope of the nightmare that was unfolding before her. It had been days since the photo shoot, and Lindsay couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had taken hold of her. She had spent the better part of the week in her apartment, her mind consumed with the paranoia that Luca was always lurking just out of sight. She felt trapped within her own life, her career, her sanctuary. Everything had been tainted by fear. Despite her best efforts to carry on with her work, Lindsay couldn't escape the feeling that Luca was everywhere. Each time she went out for a meeting or to attend a fashion event, she would find herself constantly looking over her shoulder, expecting him to appear at any moment. The phone calls, the texts, the haunting presence, all of it had become too much. But Lindsay had learned to carry on, at least outwardly. She went to her scheduled shoots and tried her best to act normal, to be the model everyone knew and admired. On the outside, she was all smiles, posing for the camera, speaking with her colleagues as if everything was fine. But inside, she was a shell of herself, consumed by the ever-present anxiety that something was going to happen. It wasn't until the night of another high-profile fashion gala that the nightmare took its darkest turn. Lindsay had just finished a photo shoot for a luxury jewelry brand, her last gig for the evening. As expected, she was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and mentally drained from the pressure of the fashion world. She was looking forward to the gala. It was a chance to unwind, to socialize with other models and designers. She wanted to feel like herself again, if only for a few hours. The event was being held at a posh hotel in the heart of the city, and Lindsay was dressed to the nines in a glamorous gown that shimmered in the soft light. When she arrived at the venue, the flashing lights from the paparazzi cameras filled the air, and the hustle and bustle of the event made it feel almost like a dream. She greeted a few familiar faces, smiled for photos, and tried to enjoy herself despite the dark cloud that had been hanging over her for weeks. But no matter how many people she was surrounded by, Lindsay couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. It was as if the world had gone silent around her, and she could feel a pair of eyes following her every move. Her heart raced and her palms grew clammy. She had to force herself to smile, to continue talking with the other guests, but she couldn't push away the gnawing fear that something wasn't right. Then it happened. As Lindsay made her way through the crowd, her eyes caught a figure standing by the entrance, just beyond the velvet ropes. He was tall, with dark hair, dressed in a black suit that made him blend into the shadows of the venue. For a moment, he seemed like just another guest, another face in the crowd. But as their eyes met, Lindsay's stomach lurched. It was him. It was Luca. She froze in place, unable to look away from him. His eyes locked with hers, and in that instant she knew. He had been stalking her this entire time. This wasn't some coincidental run-in. He had deliberately followed her here, to this event, where she was supposed to feel safe, surrounded by people who knew her. But now there was no one to protect her. Lindsay tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but the fear gripped her so tightly she could hardly breathe. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, and her vision began to blur. She couldn't let him see how afraid she was, but it was impossible to control her reaction. Her legs felt like they were made of lead as she took a step back, her mind scrambling for an escape. But Luca wasn't going anywhere. He stepped forward, moving through the crowd like a predator hunting its prey. As he neared her, Lindsay tried to keep her composure, but it was clear that Luca had no intention of staying in the shadows anymore. "Lindsay," he said, his voice low and almost intimate, sending a chill down her spine. "I knew you'd be here." His words were casual, as if they had met before, as if this were some normal encounter. But Lindsay couldn't have been more aware that it wasn't. Her body was frozen with fear, her every instinct screaming at her to run, to get away. "Luca," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" A smug smile tugged at the corners of Luca's lips, and his eyes gleamed with a mix of triumph and obsession. He didn't need to answer her question because, deep down, Lindsay already knew. He had been following her, tracking her every move, learning her routines. His obsession with her had grown to a point where it was no longer just about admiration. It was about control, power, fear. "You're so much more beautiful in person," he continued, his voice eerily calm. "I always knew we were meant to be together. You just didn't know it yet." Lindsay's stomach turned at the intensity in his words, at the way he spoke as if he had a right to her. She could feel her pulse racing, but she forced herself to remain composed. She had to get away. This wasn't just a casual encounter anymore. This was a confrontation, a dangerous one. "I don't know what you want from me, Luca," she said, her voice firm despite the fear gripping her. "But you need to leave. Now." The smile faltered for a brief moment, but Luca quickly recovered. He stepped even closer, his breath hot on her face. "I've waited too long for this, Lindsay. I won't leave. Not until you understand that I'm the one you've been looking for. You'll see. You'll realize it soon enough." The crowd around them seemed to fade into the background. Lindsay's heart was hammering in her chest, and every instinct screamed at her to get out, to run. But she knew that running wouldn't stop Luca. It would only fuel his obsession. She needed help. She scanned the room frantically, searching for someone, anyone, to intervene, but it was too late. Luca had already backed her into a corner, and she was trapped. Her thoughts raced. The flashing lights of the cameras. The public eye. If she screamed, if she tried to make a scene, it would only make things worse. But if she didn't act now, it could be too late. "Please," Lindsay said, her voice trembling. "I don't want this. Please leave me alone." Luca's expression hardened, and for a moment, Lindsay feared he would lash out. But instead, his face softened, a twisted form of affection creeping into his eyes. "You don't have to be afraid," he whispered. "I'm here for you. I'm always here." Before Lindsay could react, someone stepped between them. A tall man, muscular and imposing. It was one of the security guards. He had noticed the scene unfolding and quickly intervened, ushering Luca away. But as Luca was escorted out of the venue, Lindsay felt her legs give way beneath her. She collapsed into the arms of the security guard, her body shaking uncontrollably. "I've got you," the guard said, his voice calm but firm. "You're safe now." But Lindsay wasn't sure if she could ever feel safe again. The encounter had shaken her to her core, and no matter what happened next, she knew one thing for sure. Luca wasn't done with her. The weeks that followed the gala were a blur for Lindsay. Every waking moment felt like she was walking through a nightmare she couldn't escape. Despite the best efforts of her manager and the security team, Luca's presence lingered over her life like a dark cloud. He had followed her to events, left cryptic messages on her social media accounts, and even started showing up at her apartment building late at night. It was as if he had infiltrated every part of her existence, turning her once glamorous world into a terrifying prison. Lindsay had been advised to report him to the police, but the problem was that Luca was cunning. He had learned to cover his tracks, leaving just enough doubt to keep his actions in a gray area. He never crossed a line that would land him in handcuffs. At least, not yet. Lindsay's life, once filled with excitement and opportunities, was now dominated by fear. The phone calls kept coming, at all hours of the day and night. Sometimes they were silent, other times he would whisper her name or send her disjointed, rambling messages that made little sense but still sent shivers down her spine. She had tried to block his number, but somehow, he always found a way to reach her. She couldn't even go out for a simple walk without feeling his eyes on her, watching her every step. The paranoia was overwhelming. She could no longer trust anyone or anything. The friends she once had, those who tried to warn her about Luca, had slowly faded away, distanced themselves, and one by one, they stopped reaching out. She was left alone, isolated by her own fear and the relentless stalking of a man she barely knew. But it wasn't just the isolation that hurt the most. It was the physical toll it was taking on her. The lack of sleep, the constant tension in her body, the anxious thoughts that kept racing in her mind, it was all wearing her down. Lindsay was losing weight, her once vibrant skin had turned pale, and dark circles were starting to form under her eyes. The sparkle that had once defined her had dimmed, replaced by a haunting emptiness. She wasn't the confident model she had been just a few months ago. She was broken, hiding behind a mask of normalcy. One night, after another sleepless evening, Lindsay decided she couldn't take it anymore. She would go to her next photo shoot as planned, but something in her gut told her that it would be different this time. It was an uneasy feeling that had become all too familiar. The photo shoot was in a remote location, a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of the city. The moment she arrived, Lindsay felt the air around her grow heavy. The photographer and crew were pleasant, but something felt off. The whole atmosphere was strange, almost too perfect, like a stage set for something dark to unfold. She was just about to slip into her outfit for the first set of pictures when she heard a voice behind her, soft and almost unrecognizable. "Lindsay," the voice said, sending a chill down her spine. "I've been waiting for you." Lindsay froze, her blood running cold. It couldn't be. Not here. Not now. She turned around slowly, and there he was. Luca, standing just outside her dressing room, his face partially obscured by shadows. The moment their eyes locked, Lindsay's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't breathe. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shaking, though she tried to keep her composure. "How did you find me?" Luca stepped into the light, a twisted smile on his face. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, a flash drive. He held it up as if it was some sort of treasure. "I've been following your every move, Lindsay," he said in a low voice, his eyes gleaming with obsession. "I know everything about you, and I want you to know that this is just the beginning." Lindsay took a step back, her mind racing. She felt trapped, cornered in a room with a man who was clearly delusional. The crew and photographer had no idea what was happening. None of them could hear the conversation. None of them could see the monster that had appeared in front of her. "Please, Luca, just leave me alone," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're scaring me. This isn't love. It's obsession." Luca's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Then his expression darkened, and he took another step forward. "You'll come to see it my way eventually," he murmured almost lovingly. "You'll realize that I'm the only one who truly cares about you. These people here, they don't understand you like I do." The air between them was thick with tension, and for a moment Lindsay considered running. But her body was frozen with fear, and she was paralyzed by the thought of what he might do if she tried. She needed help. She needed someone to intervene. Before she could act, the door to the dressing room suddenly burst open. It was one of the security guards. He had heard the commotion and quickly entered the room, taking in the scene. "Hey, what's going on here?" the guard asked, his voice firm. Luca's eyes darted toward the security guard, and in that instant, Lindsay took a step back, backing herself into the corner of the room. The guard's presence seemed to snap Luca out of his trance-like state, but he didn't leave. He stood there, glaring at both Lindsay and the guard with a mix of anger and frustration. "I was just talking to her," Luca said, his voice dripping with a false sweetness. Nothing to worry about. The guard didn't buy it. He stepped closer to Luca, his demeanor shifting to one of authority. I need you to leave. Now. Luca hesitated for a brief moment, and Lindsay could see the fury in his eyes. But in the end, he backed off, turning and walking toward the door without saying another word. The guard followed him, ensuring that he left the premises. Lindsay stood there, shaking with fear and relief. Her hands were trembling, and her heart was still racing. She couldn't believe it. He had actually followed her here to the photo shoot. It was too much to handle, too much to process. But it wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. Luca wouldn't give up. He wasn't going to leave her alone. After the unsettling incident at the photo shoot, Lindsay's sense of safety was shattered. Every part of her life felt violated, her career, her privacy, and her very sense of peace. Luca had pushed his way further into her existence, and despite her best efforts, there was no escape from his hold. As the days passed, Lindsay found herself living in a constant state of dread. She barely slept, constantly checking over her shoulder, always listening for the faintest sound that might indicate Luca's presence. Even in her own apartment, once a sanctuary, she felt a sense of impending doom hanging in the air. It was as though the walls were closing in on her, and the very apartment that had once been a symbol of independence and success had become her prison. The phone calls kept coming, always at the worst possible times. Sometimes it was just silence, as if Luca was content with knowing she was there, listening but not speaking. Other times it was his voice, smooth, calm, almost soothing in its malicious intent. His words were calculated, each sentence designed to manipulate her mind and break her down little by little. Lindsay, I see you. You're so beautiful, so perfect. Why do you keep running from me? You can't hide forever. His voice would croon in the late hours of the night, just before she would drift off into a restless sleep. Each time, Lindsay would hang up, her heart pounding in her chest. She had blocked him on every possible platform, but somehow, he always found a way back. His reach seemed endless, and no matter how many steps she took to protect herself, Luca was always one step ahead. The constant fear was taking a toll on her health. Her appetite had diminished, and she found herself unable to concentrate on even the simplest tasks. Her manager had begun to notice the changes in her behavior. She wasn't showing up to her scheduled photo shoots with the same enthusiasm, and she was late to meetings. Despite her best efforts to carry on as usual, it was clear to everyone that something was wrong. One day, after a particularly sleepless night, Lindsay sat down with her manager, Rachel, to discuss what was happening. Rachel had been one of the few people who had stuck by her side since she entered the industry. She was supportive, always looking out for Lindsay's best interests, and Lindsay trusted her more than anyone else. Lindsay, I'm really worried about you. You're not the same person you were when I first met you, Rachel said, her tone concerned but gentle. You need to take a step back. This thing with Luca, it's affecting you, and I think it's time to make some real changes. Lindsay looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. She knew Rachel was right. She could feel herself unraveling, slowly but surely. But the thought of taking a break, of slowing down in the middle of her career, terrified her. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, and now she couldn't even walk down the street without fearing for her life. I don't know what to do, Rachel, Lindsay admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared all the time. Every time I go out, every time I step out of my apartment, I feel like he's right there, watching me. I don't know how much longer I can do this. Rachel nodded, her face softening. I know it's hard, but you need to get help. You can't keep doing this to yourself. You don't deserve this, Lindsay. You need to speak to the police. You need to make a report, and we'll make sure that you have the best security team possible. But Lindsay shook her head, her face contorting in frustration. I've tried. I've done everything. But he's always one step ahead. And what if no one believes me? What if they think I'm overreacting? I'm just a model, Rachel. I don't want to be seen as weak, as a victim. Rachel took Lindsay's hand gently. You're not weak, Lindsay. You're strong, and you deserve to be safe. This isn't your fault. But despite Rachel's reassurances, Lindsay felt a pit growing in her stomach. The weight of the situation seemed to be suffocating her. She didn't want to live like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, hiding in fear. But she didn't know where to turn, and she didn't know how to make it stop. That night, she couldn't sleep again. The same thoughts kept swirling in her head, and the same voice kept echoing through her mind. What if Luca was right? What if she could never escape him? What if he was always going to be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? Lindsay lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She tried to shut the thoughts out, but they wouldn't leave. She couldn't remember the last time she felt truly at peace. She didn't know what to do, and the fear was starting to consume her completely. As she turned over in bed, she heard a faint sound, a noise at her window. It was subtle, barely audible, but it was enough to send a wave of panic through her body. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly sat up in bed, straining her ears to hear. There was someone outside. She didn't move, didn't breathe as she tried to listen. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together what was happening. Could it be him? Could it really be Luca outside her window, watching her again? Lindsay's hands were shaking as she slowly reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Rachel's number. The phone rang once, twice, and then, "Lindsay? What's going on?" Rachel's voice came through, panicked and urgent. I think he's here," Lindsay whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's outside my window. He's watching me." Rachel's voice was sharp and commanding. "Stay inside. Lock all the doors and windows. Don't open the door for anyone. I'm calling the police right now. I'll be there as soon as I can." Lindsay did as she was told, her mind racing. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't cry. She couldn't. Not when she was so close to breaking free from this nightmare. She had to be strong. She had to survive. The night seemed to drag on forever. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside, only heightened Lindsay's fear. She sat on the floor beside the bed, her back pressed against the wall, eyes wide with terror as she clutched her phone, praying Rachel would be there soon. Every few seconds she would glance at the window, the shadows beyond it playing tricks on her tired mind. Had Luca somehow managed to get inside? Was he waiting for her to make a mistake, to lower her guard? The weight of the situation was crushing, and Lindsay felt as though she was drowning in fear. Minutes passed, minutes that felt like hours, and finally, her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "Help is on the way. Just hang tight." Lindsay wanted to feel comforted by the words, but all she could think about was the figure outside her window, the silhouette she had imagined for so long. The feeling of being watched never left her, and the sense of impending danger was almost suffocating. Then the silence was broken. A knock at the door. Lindsay froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she held her breath. It wasn't Rachel. She had locked the door. Who could it be? The knock came again, louder this time. "Lindsay." The voice was faint but unmistakable. Her blood ran cold. It was him, Luca. Somehow, he had found a way to get closer. She tried to steady her breathing, her eyes wide with panic. There was no way she was opening that door. She couldn't. Her mind raced as she remembered what Rachel had said. Don't open the door for anyone. Wait for the police. But fear had a hold of her, and she couldn't move. She wanted to scream, to shout, but the words caught in her throat. She was frozen, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Suddenly, there was another sound, this time coming from the hallway. A loud crash, followed by frantic footsteps. The police. They were here. Lindsay finally dared to breathe, but the terror didn't fade. She could hear shouting from the hallway, the frantic voices of the officers trying to subdue Luca. Then there was a loud thud, and everything went silent. Lindsay rushed to the door, her heart in her throat as she fumbled for the lock. When it finally opened, she found Rachel standing there, her face full of concern but relieved. Behind her were two police officers, their expressions serious. "Lindsay, are you all right?" Rachel asked, pulling her into a tight hug. Lindsay nodded, but her body felt numb. She had barely processed what was happening before she was being led out of her apartment by one of the officers. Luca had been caught. He was now in handcuffs, taken into custody for the terrifying ordeal he had put her through. But despite the sense of relief that washed over her, the dread was still there. She had been through hell, and now, even though Luca was arrested, she knew the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. Days passed, and the events of that night began to feel like a blur. Lindsay had been moved to a secure location for her safety, away from her apartment and the terrifying memories it held. Rachel had been by her side throughout the ordeal, making sure Lindsay stayed protected, while also pushing her to get the help she desperately needed. Lindsay had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to overcome any obstacle that came her way. But this was different. Luca had broken her, mentally and emotionally. She couldn't pretend it didn't affect her anymore. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face. Every time she went out, she expected him to appear. It wasn't just the fear. It was the shame, the guilt. She had been so careful, so focused on her career, and yet somehow, she had let herself fall into the grip of someone who was nothing more than a predator. How could she have been so blind to the warning signs? The therapist she was seeing explained that these feelings were normal. Survivors of stalking and similar traumas often felt as if they were responsible for what had happened, even though the blame lay entirely on the stalker. Lindsay had to come to terms with that slowly. Her therapy sessions became a lifeline, a place where she could unload her thoughts, where she could express her anger and fear without feeling ashamed. It was a process, but it was a necessary one. Meanwhile, Luca's trial loomed. Though he had been caught, the legal process was far from over. Lindsay had to testify, to relive the terror she had experienced, and it was a task she dreaded. But she knew she had to do it. She had to take control of her story, of her life. No one else would fight for her, and it was time to take back the power she had lost. As the trial progressed, Lindsay found herself surrounded by supportive friends and family who, despite her initial isolation, never gave up on her. They stood by her side, encouraging her to heal, to reclaim the parts of herself that had been stolen from her. Slowly, piece by piece, she began to rebuild her life. Though the scars of her experience would never fully disappear, Lindsay found solace in the knowledge that she was not defined by the actions of one person. She was stronger than she had ever realized. Months had passed since the terrifying ordeal with Luca, and Lindsay's life had begun to shift in ways she had never anticipated. Each day felt like a quiet victory, a step forward in reclaiming her life. While the memories of Luca's stalking still haunted her, she no longer let them define her. The therapy sessions she had committed herself to had started to yield progress. She was no longer consumed by the terror of her past, though there were still days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. Lindsay had become stronger, both emotionally and mentally, but the road to recovery was not a straight path. There were days when she felt drained, when her confidence was shaken, and the old fears crept back in. But she had learned to face them head-on, with the help of her therapist and a few trusted friends. The therapy sessions became her anchor, a place where she could vocalize the silent fears she had buried deep within. The first few weeks of her recovery were filled with raw emotion, as she processed everything she had been through. The guilt, the shame, the feelings of being out of control, they were all there, and it was hard to put them aside. But her therapist, a compassionate woman named Dr. Harris, guided her through it, helping her understand that what she experienced wasn't her fault. What Luca had done to her was not a reflection of her, but of him. Over time, the weight of her emotions grew lighter. Lindsay began to feel like herself again, even though she had changed in ways she hadn't expected. She had once been a carefree, ambitious young woman, driven by her career in modeling, but now she found herself gravitating toward a different kind of life. The world of glitz and glamour no longer held the same allure it once did. It felt distant, almost foreign. Instead, she longed for the simplicity of quieter moments. She found peace in small things, like cooking a meal for herself or reading a book in the sunlight. But it wasn't just her daily routine that was changing. Her heart, which had been closed off for so long, was opening again. She had met someone who made her feel safe and cherished in ways she hadn't thought were possible. Daniel was unlike anyone Lindsay had known before. He wasn't a part of the world she once lived in. He wasn't a photographer or an agent or anyone from the industry she had once been surrounded by. He was a teacher, quiet but confident, kind but unassuming. Their first encounter had been simple and unremarkable, but something about him had drawn Lindsay in. Perhaps it was the way he listened to her without interrupting, or how he never once pushed her boundaries. He let her take things at her own pace, and for the first time in a long while, Lindsay felt like she could breathe. They started by exchanging messages, casual at first, nothing more than a friendly connection. But as weeks passed, Lindsay found herself looking forward to their conversations. Daniel was patient, attentive, and most importantly, understanding. He never asked about her past, never questioned her about what she had been through. He let her tell him when she was ready. That alone had made a huge difference. Daniel never tried to rush her. He simply allowed Lindsay to heal, to take her time. As the relationship deepened, Lindsay noticed something remarkable. For the first time in months, she felt joy in the present. Daniel made her feel special, not because of her fame, but because of who she was, just Lindsay. He never once cared about her past or what she had gone through. He was there for her now, in the present, and that was all that mattered. It was a Sunday afternoon when they took the next step. Lindsay had invited Daniel over to her apartment for lunch. She had spent the morning preparing a meal, setting the table just for the two of them. It wasn't anything fancy, just pasta with a simple tomato sauce, a salad and fresh bread. But it felt important to her. This was the beginning of something real, something steady. It was no longer about the rush of the fashion world, no longer about the pressures of constant perfection. It was just her and Daniel, two people learning how to live life together. Over the course of the next few weeks, Lindsay began to feel things for Daniel that she hadn't felt in a long time. Trust, affection, and even love. It wasn't an overwhelming rush of emotion, but rather a steady, deep connection that grew stronger with each passing day. She found herself laughing more, smiling more, and most importantly, feeling like herself again. It was a feeling she thought she might never experience after everything that had happened, but Daniel had brought it out in her. Then the unexpected happened. Lindsay had been feeling slightly off for a few days, tired, more nauseous than usual, but she chalked it up to the emotional toll of everything she had been through. The stress, the therapy, and the constant battle to regain control over her life. But after some insistence from Daniel, she decided to take a pregnancy test just to put her mind at ease. To her shock, it came back positive. For a moment, Lindsay stood frozen in the bathroom, staring at the test as the reality of the situation sank in. She had never imagined herself becoming a mother, especially not so soon. Her career had always come first, and she had worked so hard to get to where she was, despite all the setbacks. But now, here she was, facing the life-changing reality of being pregnant. The shock quickly gave way to an overwhelming sense of emotion. She felt an odd mixture of excitement, fear, and anticipation. She had never planned on becoming a mother under these circumstances, but deep down, she realized that she was ready. In the quiet of that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over her. She called Daniel immediately, her voice shaking as she told him the news. At first, he was silent, and Lindsay's heart raced, wondering if this was too much for him to handle. But then he spoke. "Lindsay, I'm so happy. We'll figure this out together." His words brought a wave of relief. She hadn't realized how much she needed his support until that very moment. Over the next few months, Lindsay focused on the one thing she had never truly focused on before: herself. She wasn't trying to please anyone, to meet anyone's expectations. She was learning to love herself again. And now, she had someone who supported her in every way, someone who believed in her, even in her weakest moments. As the pregnancy progressed, Lindsay felt the joy of growing life inside her. She had already started imagining what life would be like with her baby. A small family, filled with love, laughter, and safety. It was a future she had never dared to dream of before. A future far removed from the darkness of her past. The scars left by Luca's torment would always be a part of her, but she had learned to live with them. They no longer defined her. She was more than what he had tried to make her. She was strong, resilient, and capable of finding happiness again. And as she stood in front of the mirror one day, rubbing her growing belly, Lindsay realized something. She had made it. She had survived. She had found love, hope, and a future filled with possibilities. And no one, least of all Luca, could take that away from her.